Hi everyone and welcome to the next video. Today we're going to look at a fantastic game from the 1954 World Championship match played between the two chess titans Mikhail Botvinnik and Vassily Smyslov, who were both world champions at least once during their lifetimes. If you have not seen or studied their World Championship matches before, then I strongly suggest doing so, as they played amazing chess against each other. Their styles were very suited for aggressive and fighting games against each other, similarly to what we see between Carlsen and Kramnik today. Being world champions, of course, they can both be considered genius in terms of chess. This game was played halfway through their match for the world title. Botvinnik had white and opened with d4, after which came knight f6, which is going into one of the Indian defences, most probably, and indeed the game did so after c4, g6, aiming to fianchetto the king's bishop, of course, although strictly speaking, we could also see a Grunfeld defence if white had played knight c3 here and black had answered d5. But instead of that, Botvinnik played g3, which is going to lead to the fianchetto variation of the King's Indian defence, which is one of the most solid ways to play against the King's Indian, and the most soul-destroying for the player with the black pieces, as the usual plan of aiming to lock the centre and breaking with f5 and kingside pawn storm is ill-advised, as the white king is much better defended than usual thanks to his bishop on g2. So, play continued bishop g7 and bishop g2, and having played c4 and bishop g2, white will have to keep an eye on his c4 pawn and square, as it's been somewhat weakened, although black's in no position to exploit it just yet, of course. But he can aim to later with piece pressure, or he can try and provoke b3, after which this sensitive diagonal will have been weakened. So, Smyslov now castled, and after knight c3 he played d6, preparing a later e5 break in order to equalize. White now has a small space advantage, but nothing more. Botvinnik continued development with knight f3, and after knight bd7 he castled. And here Smyslov broke immediately with e5, and white doesn't want to release the central tension with d takes e5, because it will weaken his central control and give black the c5 square for his knight. On the contrary, Botvinnik wants to increase his central grip, and with the knight on c3 here working in conjunction with the bishop g2 on these light squares, it makes sense to play his move here e4, which creates a bind on black playing a later d5 in order to fully liberate his game and, again aim for equalization. Smyslov continued with c6, which keeps an eye on b5 and d5, the knight here on c3, and prevents a later knight d5, which could be used in conjunction with bishop g5, pinning the knight. And Botvinnik maintained the tension further now with bishop e3, aiming perhaps for a later queen d2 and bishop h6 in order to trade off black's dark squared bishop, which is not a bad idea generally speaking if there is nothing better to do. Often, however, in King's Indian positions, the center pawns, in King's Indian positions, the center pawns are locked, and in those cases it makes no sense to initiate such an exchange. Say, for example, if d5 and c5 has been played here, these central pawns are blocking in the bishop on g7, and so it's a badly hampered piece, and it doesn't make sense to trade it off, and the white pawns are usually fixed on light squares, which makes the dark squared bishop the stronger out of the two white bishops. So, Smyslov continued with knight g4, attacking the bishop on e3, and allowing black this move is the downside in Botvinnik's last move. White doesn't want to lose the bishop pair, as black still has the option of opening the center up and the game, obviously the bishops will be strong. So now the bishop has to move. However, Botvinnik has of course foreseen this, and here he can play bishop g5 with tempo as it attacks the queen. And it also threatens a later bishop e7, forking the rook and the d6 pawn. Smyslov in turn had of course foreseen this move too, and here played queen b6, and all of a sudden black is starting to get active play already. This move, queen b6, adds pressure to d4, which is under fire already, and also attacks the b2 pawn. So how does white deal with this? If you want to have a look and try and find the best move, then please stop the video here. h3 is what Botvinnik played, and is the simplest and best way to meet the threats of the position. It's tempting to play bishop e7 instead, but black is better. After rook e8, attacking the bishop, so bishop takes d6, now e takes d4, forcing knight a4, attacking the queen, and now queen a6, threatening to take on both c4 and e4 with the rook, although taking there would be unwise because of the bishop here, and the pressure that the queen has on the a4 knight means that knight takes d4 is not playable here. It loses a piece after bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and queen takes a4. And the reason this line is weak for white is because his best move here is b3, which gives black tactical options on the a1 rook along this long diagonal, along with his dangerous passed pawn. But now black can continue with b5, and after the more or less forced line, knight c5, knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, black is still better after b takes c4, b takes c4, and d3, discovering an attack on the a1 rook. And white can give up the exchange for a pawn here with queen takes d3 and hope to exploit the weak dark squares after bishop takes a1 and rook takes a1. But there are many semi and fully open files for the black rooks to exploit, and white has lots of weak pawns, so it's probably not advisable, although black would have to be careful regarding the dark squares around his king. Probably better is bishop d4, but now comes bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, and knight e5, and black is definitely better. In most of these variations, the c4 pawn will be dropping, which is weak for the reasons I indicated in the opening phase. Okay, so back to the game continuation anyway. Botvinnik has just played h3, attacking the knight. And Smyslov continued with e takes d4, which can still be played now, because it's attacking the c3 knight. So if h takes g4, there's d takes c3, with advantage for black. We can have a look at that in a moment, but first of all, what were the other options for black at this stage? One variation that looks tempting is queen takes b2, allowing for queen takes c3 in the event of h takes g4, which is going to win a pawn and do some damage to the white pawn structure. But now of course white has knight a4 attacking the queen, and due to the attack on the g4 knight, the black queen is obliged to create a threat of her own, and black's going to go a piece down here, but he can play queen b4, which is threatening b5, which is going to trap the knight. He'll have no escape squares. And the best way for white to keep an edge is with a3, although rook b1 is also playable. And here black has queen takes c4. It's the best that he has, and he's allowing his knight to fall with very good compensation after h takes g4 and e takes d4, with 3 pawns, including 2 passed pawns for the knight, and fractured black pawns to attack, as well as a huge pawn majority on the queen side. for active play, so it would be an interesting and dynamic position. White would aim to simplify and get to a good endgame, and black would aim to advance its queenside majority and keep pieces on the board. Okay, but back to the game continuation anyway. Smyslov has just played e takes d4. And next came knight a4, which attacks the queen and apparently provokes a crisis, as black now has two pieces under fire, as we saw in a variation a moment ago. But there's a tactical trick that Smyslov had up his sleeve here, as he can now play queen a6. And after h takes g4, b5 traps the white knight, as we saw in the previous variation. And this is a trick worth knowing, as it's a positional idea that crops up occasionally in games. And black is managing to seize the initiative here, and already both the pawn structure and the game have become very imbalanced, which invariably leads to interesting and dynamic play. Botvinnik is now able, however, to win back the pawn he's dropped with knight takes d4, which results in a very nicely posted central knight, and this is easily the best continuation and significantly stronger than bishop e7, which, although it would win the d6 pawn, gets a little bit messy and tactically dangerous. And you'll also see why he didn't want to exchange pawns on b5 before taking the pawn on d4 in a moment. And you know, black is now a piece down, of course, so here his move is forced with b takes a4, and now comes knight takes c6, which is the reason Botvinnik didn't trade on b5, because he can take this pawn now. And this is going to win the exchange. And you know, black is obliged to take here. If he doesn't, then knight b4 is coming next with tempo, and he's lost a pawn for nothing. And Smyslov presumably had calculated all of this, as had Botvinnik, and we'll see whose judgment was correct as the rest of the game unfolds. Smyslov took the knight with queen takes c6, and after e5, discovering an attack on the queen and winning the a8 rook, he played queen takes c4, which leaves each side with 6 pawns. But now comes bishop takes a8, so black has gone the exchange down. And is there enough compensation? You know, it's a very open position. Sometimes sacking the exchange is strategically justified if there are many pawns left on the board, and knights, for example, can outmaneuver rooks. But here it's very difficult to judge accurately which side will stand better in the long run. Intuition would lead us to believe that it is white with such an open board, but the computer confirms that at this moment the position is almost dead equal, so both sides still have everything to play for, and the fireworks are far from over. Smyslov continued with knight takes e5, which gets the knight to a strong central square and goes a pawn ahead. Even if queen takes d6 here, the g4 pawn will drop next. So black does have a pawn for the exchange, but objectively speaking, the position remains equal, which implies that black has a slight positional advantage. It's important to note here too that playing instead d takes e5 is bad for black after rook c1, queen d4, and bishop e7, which forces rook e8 and now rook c7, and it's white who has the advantage and all of the play in the position. So knight takes c5 was the right move. And here came rook c1 from Botvinnik, which was a slight inaccuracy, although it's logical to get the rooks working on the open files. Stronger was queen takes d6, where best for black is bishop e6. It's tempting to take the g-pawn instead, but more important positionally to prevent bishop f6, which allows for simplifications that would favor white, being the exchange up. And this move discovers an attack on the bishop on a8 in combination with the development of the light squared bishop. And white's best response is bishop f4, which combines offense with defense, and rook takes a8 would hand white the advantage here, as again it leads to simplifications. Best is knight takes g4, which is going to win a second pawn for the exchange after the a8 bishop moves, for example, to f3, applying some pressure to the knight, and now bishop takes b2 with good play for the exchange and loads of activity left in the position. But anyway, back to the game continuation.